Papa, darf man hier Fallschirm springen?
This is your cell.
Si eres ladrillo, seré concreto. Si eres oreja, seré Van Gogh. Si eres
فما كاري ابيض فما ريكتانجل ابيض فيرتيكال.
تو دي تصور دي كيك
I ben het.
Oder bleibt es Utopie? Jeder Mensch weiß, es ist ein Kreis, nimmer weit, Elend und Leid, der Liege treibt, innerlich schreit sich zerreißt.
Hello, welcome to our first talk back format this year. Last year we already began with this format in a more informal setting in a bar where we discussed the relationship between filmmakers and film criticism. And this year we want to continue this focus a bit in another more direct format. And yeah, as you might know, we see the Critics Week also as a laboratory for new discussion formats and also to undermine a bit the routines of of how a discourse is modulated in the festival circuit. And yeah, sometimes we don't even invite the directors to the panels after the films. For example, on Tuesday we discussed in the context of our first festival partnership with the Black Canvas Contemporary Film Festival and the Duisburger Filmwoche, the film's Intimate Distances and First In, First Out, together with Pedro Seguro, Alexander Scholz, Sandra Wollner, and Pascal Capitulin, moderated by Janaína Oliveira. And I think it was a very thought-provoking talk, and yeah, now I'm even more curious about the perspective of one of the directors. I'm very happy that he's here with me in the Zoom conference. Welcome to Critics Week, Phillip Warnell.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, thank you for contributing to Critics Week today. And yeah, maybe we could start with a also very open question about how did you perceived the talk about your film, these 5 invited guests.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd just concur with the premise that you followed there, and the idea that let's say remodulating discourses beyond the standard terms of the festival is a very, very, actually I found it enormously helpful in a strange way, not to be present, or rather present through my absence in a sense. And I actually also felt it was very useful for me not to have to be, there's often a kind of holding to account of a director in a certain sense. One has to put up a defense to a certain extent. When especially in the environment where it's directly addressing the film somehow, it becomes slightly evidential. I won't go so far as to say it becomes like a judicial, but of course, certainly my film has a kind of judicial sort of undertone that's sort of buried, or not so deeply buried, really. So I really enjoyed the fact that the panel came from kind of broad perspectives that actually I hadn't anticipated, that the rhythm, I could enjoy the kind of rhythm of the conversation without needing to interject. It was great.
Yeah, and maybe to go one step brighter. Well, how is in general, your relationship to film criticism? Do you like to read about your film? Do you enjoy reading critics or texts about it?
Well, well, it depends somewhat. I would say, I mean, obviously people bring them to your attention, you know, yes, you do read them, and yes, I mean, they're kind of, the whole, I would say that the whole gamut of a register in terms of how I respond to them, they can be inspirational. They can be, you know, I'm thinking of I'm listing some positives first. It can be deeply rewarding, to actually eye-opening, I would say. Very often people bringing things to your attention about your projects that, I mean, as I've already mentioned, really, that you just maybe weren't even aware of, which I find really of enormous value. And actually, yes, that too, the sheer articulation of these matters in other terms, especially in the written form, is incredibly rewarding. On the other hand, yes, of course, there can also be, you know, the kind of scratching of the head response, and the downright, you know, slightly venomous need for revenge or something. But you if you put work out there, you have to be open to the receipt of whatever perspectives come your way. And I've you know, I've learned to respect the fact that in whichever forum, people want to have their say, and they will.
Yeah, and was there something maybe eye-opening, or maybe also a moment where you felt that there was a need to intervene in the discussion you watched on Critics Week?
Not on my part, no.
Okay.
I really enjoyed the kind of the lack of that requirement for, and in fact, you know, it's not that, and I'm very keen on the idea that it's not that the director is in any way, shape, or form the kind of authority, or the go-to even person relative to a project. Quite the contrary, as everyone knows, it may be a cliche, but nevertheless, it's very hard to see your own work. And I think for that reason alone, sometimes stepping back and stepping out of the picture, out of the frame, actually gives you the chance to see it for not necessarily what it is, but at least form a variation in the kind of engagement that you have with it. So no, nothing that I wanted to kind of verify or intervene relative to, but I did. It was more that I mean, I've actually got a few notes. I was making some notes. I was thinking, for example, about the way that the discussion was attuned to the notion of watching films or engaging with films that are in search of a story. And I really like this idea that there is a kind of a provisional engagement in those films whereby one hasn't quite arrived at the film itself. You know, it's approaching the film, or it's the search is the right word, really, or it's the journey towards something. And I think I had that very much in mind. And in a certain sense, it also freed me up when I was working on this project, because I didn't even really know I'd started making the film. I was working at the cusp of where research steps into production. And you know, but I paid very little attention to that threshold. But it meant that we did what we did with a certain level of freedom that I might not have had otherwise.
Yeah, maybe we could. I think that what you've mentioned that was a point that Alexander made directly at the beginning, right, where he talked about these films and that they are in search of something, both films. And yeah, also I think there was a lot of points that related to both films. One of it was, for example, Pascal mentioned the cancellation of the context a bit of your film, and the decision to include also the noise from the street, and as well a quite dominant score. So the sound seemed very important to create this intimate and distant space, cinematic space. And yeah, maybe you could elaborate a bit more on that, because I thought it was a really interesting point.
Yes, I mean, yeah, the relationship between intimacy and distance for me is something. Well, for me it operates in. There's many different kind of layers of thinking relative to that, and first and foremost, in the really the approach to the project, and probably other projects of mine actually, I'm very interested in the idea that distance is almost a kind of prerequisite for or in the development of intimacy. One needs distance, one needs something to approach. Otherwise, you know, you don't have any kind of these modulations, these fluctuations, or the oscillations between a near and a far, or a perspective that is embodied and something that is, you know, other than embodied. So I'm very interested in that kind of, I suppose I like to think of it as contact at distance, actually. Georges Didier Huberman has written about this at some length. And so I've always been involved in that kind of thought process. But in terms of the sound of the film itself, it was a very strange post-production process in many respects, the forming or the kind of elaborations of the sound design, because on the one hand we were working with material that wasn't there, like we didn't really have any recordings, decent recordings of the streets. We weren't recording wild track whilst we were filming, and we were just concentrating on trying to ensure that both Martha and her, you know, interviewees, the people she encountered, were on mic. We were trying to make sure that we could actually hear what was being said, or rather, our sound recordist was trying to do that. I wasn't trying to do that at all. In fact, I had no idea what was being said during the encounters themselves. But in post, with Phillip, the Swiss sound designer that I worked with, we were therefore engaged in partly in a process of trying to kind of re-establish the urban space and the kind of specifics of that, and much of it is, you know, folied or appropriated. It really is an assemblage in that sense. And then the other part of our work was trying to, I suppose, augment a sense of the specificity of where we were, i.e. Steinway Street. So we really worked and introduced things like, I mean, you know, that part of the soundtrack is a prepared piano, a Steinway prepared piano piece. And of course, Steinway is the place of manufacture of these, and sort of unavoidably so. So I quite wanted to include that element. And similarly, at one end of the street is Rikers Island, the prison, which is actually due for closure in 2026. But that wasn't known at the time when we were shooting. So, for example, we have included, you know, kind of off-screen protest material of an anti-Rikers Island protest. and so we've kind of, you know, it's a very constructed soundtrack, and I think what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of movement in that soundtrack between close-up detail, kind of, you know, urban space that's sprawling and atmospheric, and then more issue-based propositions that we've also included. So yeah, it certainly shifts in terms of its emphasis.
Yeah. Yeah, this shifting is very present. I also thought about one thing that especially Janina and Sandra mentioned, that they were quite surprised about the openness of the interviewees. And
Yes.
yeah, obviously also the panel talked a lot about these gaps and how they are really exposed, or that the off-screen is this cancellation Pascal talked about, and all these gaps are very important, and that maybe also one of these gaps is the lack of information of the context, maybe after the approaching, or how far they realize that there's a camera. And because maybe you could talk a bit about this.
Yes. Yeah, I'm feeling rather pleased with, you have to excuse me, feeling rather pleased with myself that we took a bunch of decisions about, that relate to cancellations, what's left out, the sense of presence of a camera crew, which I was very keen to avoid. And even actually Martha's questions, you know, we deliberated on how those would kind of map onto the circumstance. And I think that cancellation permeates the film in many respects. You know, Martha isn't sort of introduced as a casting director, kind of going around looking for a specific character for a specific project. And whilst the film is written up in a sense that is actually what she's doing, in fact, that in a certain sense isn't what she was doing, because we didn't cast anyone and we didn't make a film with the casting. It's not about casting someone. It's about, I guess, exposing the process of her methodology on some level, but actually how that method transcends itself into this sort of space of a much more kind of space of humanity, and this sort of opening up, and even providing a channel for this remote intimacy of sorts. But what I've really enjoyed, I think, that I think was made mention of in the cancellation process is how you, at the beginning of a scene, as it were, in the film, you can't even find where Martha and her interviewee are necessarily. You have no idea. You have to, as an audience, as a viewer, you have to contend with a kind of process of arrival yourself. And I think this is a really, really crucial part of the intentionality of the film, whereby rather than kind of cut our way to the action, as it were, we almost we kind of amble or sort of peruse our way, or I don't know, we kind of movement image our way or smooth our way. But of course, it's actually zooming our way. It's almost done in a slightly unconscious fashion at certain points, and it kind of creeps up on you, I think, the fact that you kind of arrive in this very, very personal space where and cross that threshold of, you know, public into private. And whilst the sound may already be there, it precedes us. It does do something relative to the kind of treatment, I think, that the film you know, makes use of. And yes, I think that the panel seem to be you know, very kind of acutely aware of that and how that's positioned relative to a number of the issues in the film. So it was super interesting for me.
Yeah, maybe regarding this perspective, and that how you described it, that sometimes we cannot really know where they are, or we are searching Martha, and where, especially in the scene when the intimacy is increasingly and yeah, very high, and then with a very emotional hug. And at first you're really searching Martha there, and yeah, then the camera is approaching it, and a bit also anticipating this this emotional flow that is created in this moment.
Exactly. But in a strange way, it mirrors the way in which the film was shot, because actually Martha was conducting interviews, and sometimes we couldn't find her with the camera. We were completely lost, and we'd have to call someone. Where is she? She's at the intersection of 34th and Stein. Okay, and we were embarked on an alternative, but just as necessary search to to kind of introduce her into the frame. And so when in post, I wanted to emphasize that. And it's oft forgotten that there are other kind of intimate distances. There's on a project like this, which is actually the first ever digital film I've made, it struck me that there was another distance, and that was between me and my cinematographer in terms of the direction of his attention. I'd be, what's he doing? Why is he shooting that? What's happening here? And because you tend to just roll rather than, direct a shot, as it were. So we were dealing with all of these kind of, gaps and intervals between a kind of concrete relationship to the shot that made it all the more something that was worth kind of maintaining, I suppose, in the film itself.
And what was maybe the interest, especially in this perspective from above, because in the talk there was mentioned a lot these power relations that are obviously articulated through this perspective also, and that Pedro, for example, mentioned the conversation by Coppola for this and in text sometimes people write about a sniper kind of gaze. And I think also in relation how you described it, that sometimes the camera is following people and you don't even know why or what is the interest now behind the gaze.
Absolutely. I mean, and some of that material, for that last point, some of that material I've included where my director of photography is just I think the word is roving. And I love this idea that I think I don't quite recall, but it may have been in a pause where Martha was having a sandwich or something, and the director of photography decided to embark on a different kind of search, and I really enjoyed that element to it. But well, it's a tricky one, the whole idea of the sort of surveillance mode, really. I've got very mixed feelings about that. Well, let's say that word, surveillance, with everything that comes with it. There's sort of course, there are issues there around sort of power relations and observations and whatnot. But I was convinced that we needed, a kind of extended distance, and I think I would slightly distance myself from suggesting that was explicitly surveillance in its form and format. I think I'd like to think there's a bit more to it than that. It also traps us into an agenda of sorts. So I'd like to think it went slightly beyond that. But actually, the research that I've been doing around the film, as it were, for me, has impacted in many ways relative to how sort of police profiling techniques and cinema casting techniques are very much actually rather concomitant, even in their emergence, in a kind of 19th century emergence, really. And I've been just as interested in both. So I cannot deny that element has probably kind of permeated my screen, and undoubtedly so. But I'd like to think that, and indeed in some of the writing that I've read, even very recently on the film that you kindly forwarded to me, that it is, you know, it's not that that's strategic. It's to try to provide a sort of open structure within which other things might, and I think did happen. But certainly I'm really fascinated by the almost kind of synergy between the criminal act and the cinematic form. And I think this project was my, if you'll excuse the pun, first stab at that. And I fully intend to pursue that further.
Okay, interesting. Yes, maybe we could, as I already mentioned, that Pedro mentioned Coppola, for example, but also Sandra Wollner talked about Cinema Verité, Chronique d'un été, I think, and yeah, also I was reminded of Pasolini and Discomici d'Amore when he asked people very intimate questions, also on the street. But yeah, maybe were there films, or you mentioned a book also, that accompanied your process during the film?
Well, I was actually reading a lot about prison writing, and I still am. So the writings of those incarcerated, and I was thinking a lot about how solitude shapes character, and still am, that kind of, and that sort of, this sort of ungraspable but very intense search, again, that we're all involved in towards trying to shape an identity and what the constitution of identity. So in terms of films, I was actually quite thinking of one film Martha worked on with Albert Maysles, which is called In Transit. And, you know, he was a great exponent of, I think they called it direct cinema, where the entirety of the production was kind of rolling through town, as it were. And in this film In Transit, which I've actually never seen, they are casting on a train between New York and Chicago and identifying people whose story they might kind of bring forward into the film, and then you know, interviewing or working with them whilst kind of traveling through the train themselves as a crew. And I really love this idea. And of course, yeah, the Rouge and many films make use of these motifs. I'm actually not a great fan of vox pop technique. I actually find it rather vulgar and journalistic, and sometimes even unethical in extremis, really. So it was a battleground for me to try to work in this domain with any degree of success. But yeah, I sometimes the things that one clings to you know, as kind of what nourishes what you're working on can be the most peculiar. I couldn't stop thinking of the Pirandello play, Six Characters in Search of an Author. And this just simple sort of reworking or re-engineering or reverse engineering the process by which something comes to pass on screen. And I think we were, you know, sort of engaging with something akin to that on Intimate Distances, relative to the inclusion of the testimony that kind of sits alongside Martha's encounters, as it were.
Yeah, especially this, or in transit is maybe a nice word, because it's, I think the film is also always like, searching for these transitions, or also, as you mentioned at first, there's this very you feel from the spy perspective maybe very an agenda, or that there's maybe something aggressive in this case, because it is related to surveillance capitalism and everything. But then you feel, then there's this transition to and you also think that Martha maybe has an agenda, but at the end she is really interested in the people in a way also. So
definitely. Although again, that is something that I found, that empathic quality is something that I mean, I was doing a lot of research into other people's auditioning techniques at the time with a casting agency in New York when I made the film, and very particularly was struck by the extent of how empathic these street scouts can be, to the point where people are really you know, and actually the first words in Intimate Distances make that sort of abundant. They bring it to the table, that it's an audition, it's a testimony, it's a kind of confession, it's the status of the dialogue in a street scouting encounter is very fluid, you know, in terms of exactly what is taking place and shaping up there. So as an informal space for garnering people's thought and emotional life, it's kind of extraordinary. And hence the voiceover text is actually an audition. It's from an audition. It's a redacted audition. I think I was trying to work with a materialization of a voiceover that, you know, brought to our attention just how extraordinarily just how unknowable the status of such an audition might be, to a degree.
Yeah, also Sandra Warnell, for example, said also that to a degree, sometimes this documentary approach, or also this casting approach, could be a way of this man-eating paradigm, or man-eater aspect of it. Pascal differentiated it a bit with that everyone could eat only a slice of a character, of a life. But how do you relate to this exploitative maybe, but also sometimes maybe problematic way of approaching people?
Well, I mean, undoubtedly there are problematic and ethical issues about approaching people for their contribution, their involvement, and my own view. I've got there's two aspects to my thinking on this. One is that I'm a great advocate of that film sits on a kind of there's an ethical dilemma, and the ethical dilemma is kind of inscribed within the film. It may be a different dilemma depending on the film and who's involved, but nevertheless there is something there to contend with. And I think we are tasked with simply trying to contend with that in whatever way, shape, and form. We have to grapple with it. And for me, it's not about just getting release forms signed off. And I'm constantly being reminded by people that you might get someone's contribution released and signed off at the point at which they make it, but of course then you go off and make a film. So how many times do you need them to sign it off? It's very fraught. It's a fraught process. I'm very conscious of that. And I it's boundless. I don't think it's something that needs solving. I think it's something to remain acutely aware of. And I think the onus is on filmmakers to ask questions of their role and position. I really do. And I struggle with that. But if I may take that hat off and put another one on, I'm also deeply interested in this sort of the way that this sort of actually I'm doing quite a lot of research at the moment into a condition called prosopagnosia, which is the register within which we think and are able to recognize others' faces. And it's an extraordinary, not even necessarily a condition, but it's actually, I think of it as a register whereby some people are completely face blind and they can't recognize anybody, including themselves. And there are other people, they call them super recognizers, who recognize absolutely anyone they have ever seen, well beyond a computer, a surveillance system, or an algorithm. So we are, gauging our interactions somewhere along this line. It's not a fixed thing. It's not that we all, it's not that identities are fixed, I think is my point. And I think the film is part of my engagement, trying to sort of, let's say, substantiate thinking based around that proposition.
Yes, one.
Does that make sense? Sorry,
Yeah.
I may have.
Yeah, sure. I was just thinking about another aspect related to some of the critics I read about your film, and a lot of people obviously are mentioning or relating the film now to the pandemic situation and the other reception of it in a way.
Yes.
And I was wondering if your perception of your own film has changed in the last year or
Yes. Well, yes. I mean, it started at Vision de Réal last spring, where I think there was quite a bit of talk about the film being sort of prescient in a way, or kind of, reminding us about the one thing that's truly gone, about how you kind of construct relations through the kind of contingencies of the street. And it's something that really interests me. And I mean, I lament the loss of that contact as much as anyone else, and I'm just as vulnerable. I mean, I'm an urban person, but I feel completely vulnerable at the moment, and where that vulnerability comes from for everyone is just kind of unprecedented and hard to contend with, and it's certainly not something that I can summarize in any way, shape, or form. I feel that we're all still exposed to that and having to come to terms with it. But it's at the same time, I'm extremely pleased that the film makes that street encounter, and perhaps that kind of culminatory point of a hug with a complete stranger is one of the moments in which the film touches a nerve, in a sense. And it obviously, it's just something I'm rather pleased that has been introduced to the frame.
Yes, I think we are now nearly finished with the third time. Thank you very much, Philip. Or do you have anything else you want to mention about the debate, about the text?
I would urge others to follow suit and have a think about the what's the requirement to really develop the discourse on a film at the point of a kind of premiere status, first viewings and first screenings, because I really concur with your approach and that process, that not to exclude directors completely, but to change the frame of register beyond, the one who programmed and the one who made.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, unfortunately, Zacharias couldn't have been with us today, but because he's shooting his film now, his next. But yeah, it was also really a pleasure for me to talk to you, and thank you very much for being open to this format. And
not at all, pleasure's mine. I really appreciate it.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Philip. See you soon, hopefully in summer maybe.
Look forward to it. Bye-bye.
Bye.